Maybe we could start. You could tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to your role at Gannett.
Absolutely. So right now, as you mentioned, I am with Gannett, leading their user retention and engagement efforts. I had a very interesting, journey towards this role. So my prior three jobs, I've set up data science and analytics functions for companies like Heineken. So I basically their data science function in the US, as well as help build the function globally. Then I went to Hilton, where I led marketing as well as digital analytics for not just the US, but also for Singapore, Asia Pacific and Europe. And then I came to CVS Health. So CVS has this part of their business called as Medicare, very focused on acquisition. So they started scratching the surface on retention, and they wanted someone to kind of come in and set up analytics function for the Medicare retention business. So I did that, and now I'm at Gannett. So Gannett, our USA Today network, we have a strong legacy of being in the country and being in the news business for over 100 years. So we have a great legacy. We have a lot of awards to our credential. And where we are right now is we are trying to build upon that legacy, but also try and innovate and transform ourselves so that we are prepared to better answer and better address the need of the customer of today and our future customer who might be with us today or who might be coming to us in the future. So as we do that, it is very important for us to kind of tie together the data and analytics, insights, and more importantly, strategy to make sure we are prepared. We are giving to our users what they expect out of us. Before my prior roles, I was with Coca-Cola as a consultant, Dell Computers, and then I was at PayPal. So done a lot of data science and analytics, and heavily focused on their function and use within marketing and digital. So very excited again.
Great, thank you. So when we were talking earlier, we were talking about how the ROI around third-party cookies really has been dropping for quite some time. Become less effective even before the industry started making headlines about moving away from them. Can you talk to us about what you have seen there?
That's a great question. So absolutely. So what I would like to remind us is, and this is from more than 10 years back, when I was working for companies like Dell Computers, we were still learning a lot about how to use and how to basically as well as investments using cookies, customers and understand who the exact customer is. But since we did not really have much of it, or at least the knowledge around it, we were using a lot of probabilistic and statistical techniques to try and predict user might be based on what time are they logging in, where are they coming in from, and also this information, by the way, you can get from their IP address or from their ISP. So we had that basic information, and then we looked at our own records, meaning our first party records of so was a purchase, for example, made on Dell.com, and somebody bought a laptop. We know who that somebody is because that's our first party data set, and we know that customer of ours. Now we know that that customer shops at, let's say, 11 a.m. in the morning. So if there's another customer that's logging in at 11 a.m. from that zip code, we have a general sense of who that customer might be. So we used to kind of, predict, and then our engagement and targeting efforts around that kind of lookalike customer. And then slowly and surely we had more and more information around cookies. And we started learning how to connect the dots. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, cookies on the digital side need to be tied in with some kind of offline, that we have this holistic picture of how many touch points had with us. And based on this multi-touch attribution, we should understand, okay, what is the logical flow of chat and touch points? So in that vein, we were in my previous role or previous to previous role at Hilton, we were trying to understand, okay, how do we connect the dots? How do we connect these channels? How do we, who the user is? So we were trying to kind of, run RFPs, talk to vendors, understanding what is our ability to basically understand who this exact customer seen in social media back and seen our ad on TV and bam, 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 and channels been put together, get the customer to convert and with us or room with us, right? And then we had when we were in the process, we realized it is super expensive to do that, to kind of connect the dots and try and understand who this customer is. And then we talked about what is the ROI to your question mark on investment from our side to understand this exact customer. And when I say basically understanding, okay, if you don't really know who the exact customer is, and if you're running your programs with a general idea of who the customer might be, so you are targeting maybe 70 or 75% of the times accurately. Let's say you know who the customer is, and then you start targeting at 95% times accurately. So that 20% delta, is that worth it, right? So, and that's when you realize maybe not, maybe it's too expensive to kind of do it. So maybe let's try and back to probability and a general federated model to try and understand this cohort behaves in this way, so that's how we should approach our content towards it. So I think it's very important, not just marketeers, for any business role, to make sure we understand are we too worried, are we getting too distracted by perfection. Now that everybody knows, or most of us know statistics, most of a model accuracy, it doesn't really mean we don't have to chase a 99% accurate model. Sometimes it is about the instinct, and it's also about timeliness. You can't really wait for let's say even the cookies were not going away, we had everything in the perfect world. Even then, I've seen a lot of companies waste way too much time in perfecting who the exact customer is. And then when you ask them to take a step back and think about all that effort that went into perfecting stuff, was it worth it? The bus, because somebody else kind of did not really wait too long, and they kind of went in the market, they tried, tested, learned, sometimes failed, but at least they tried for you. So that's a long-winded way of saying that that always and always and always evaluate what is it that you are putting your effort in, and is that level of effort truly worth the level of leverage that's coming out of it.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And we had also talked about the data sets that we look at going forward may well be smaller, right? But not only is that okay, it's probably preferable, right? If it means that the data is more actionable.
100%. And it's interesting I say that, being a data guy. I remember at PayPal, for example, we were trying to kind of optimize our digital campaigns, right? And we were trying to kind of come up with beautiful analysis on what is working, what is not working. The only catch was our analysis was coming at 4 weeks after the campaign was over, and typical relaunch date or launch of a new campaign was happening at 3 weeks. So you were almost all, because you're trying to kind of chase that perfect analysis. And then we actually went real-time campaign optimization dashboard that maybe wasn't as accurate, but was super timely. And then we started seeing the lift, because sometimes simple things mean so much more. And those simple things could be a link on your campaign is broken. And that's why the traffic is falling. You don't really have to kind of, overkill. And to your point, less is more, more often than not.
Absolutely. I do want to remind everyone that we have the Q&A button, so you can drop questions there, and we'll take them as they come in. So one that just came in, Shiv, how can brands that have been around for a long time, how can you stay relevant? And in particular, how can you attract Gen Z, millennials, other types of demographics without sacrificing your own brand identity, right? But it's a just kind of classic growth question, right? How how do you add or continue to bring in different demographics, particularly in today's world, right? When we were talking about this with Damon, where there's just so much choice for consumers and such specialized choice. How do you approach that from a marketing standpoint?
That's a brilliant question, and definitely not an easy one to answer.
Right.
It's a very interesting one. So what I would say is, like, at least what I've so pattern in my last 3 or 4 roles, I've worked for, like, anything from like a 150-year-old company to, like, a 110-year, 102-year-old company. So at all these legacy organizations, like, one thing that was common is, like, they were, like, transforming, they were willing to kind of, change, and they were all focused the next set of customers, right? Like, you don't really expect the one that has been paying you for like the last 50 years to kind of keep paying you for the next 50 years, right? So I think what I've realized is, like, 3 things. Like, one, it is very important to think of your customer as not an outsider. Like, think of your customer as another member of your extended team, and you are working with customer on the same team. You're not different teams. Like, it's not, and like, I'm sure all of you heard this. When you negotiate, like, when you kind of, close a contract, the best negotiations happen when, like, you think like the other person on the other side of the table. If you think, like, of only your interest, it's not a great negotiation, like, outcome. So what I would say is, like, think of your customer, like, as an extended member of your team. And what I mean by that is, you are not winning or losing in that, like, you're not selling something and you're one and done, and, like, you're forgetting about your customer. And it's a bit of cliche here, but, like, be obsessed about the value that your customer is getting. And that value does not have to be a stagnant, like, a one-time thing, right? So what I mean by that is, let's say you, and especially, like, now in my current role, I'm very focused on subscriptions. So subscriptions basically mean, like, our customers have to buy from us, like, every single, like, month or every week, like, whatever their paying cycle is, like, every year. And for that to happen, like, the customers need to get, like, the most return from their investments. So they are putting money in us, and they want for us to kind of, keep growing that value for them. So they are like our stakeholders, like, they are like our shareholders. They might not really, like, putting in and buying in stocks, but, like, we need to be obsessed about understanding the value by segment. So look at, like, who your current customer is, look at, like, who is leaving you, and look at one who is joining you or who you want to kind of bring in. And then look at the value that you're providing to them at the time of signing up or joining, or, like, buying your product. And what is the value that you're providing to them over time? If you're selling a soap, if you're selling beer, you can't really keep selling the same beer to the same customer for like 50 years. You have to kind of, and you kind of, like, have to kind of sometimes dive so that you kind of, address the needs of your customer. Mm-hmm. And last but not the least, customers today are, like, and we always have to think of our customers as, like, smarter than us. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is, all companies that I've worked with traditionally have focused on customer lifetime value. Like, you acquire the customer, how much does the customer mean to you today, and how much does that customer mean to you, like, 10 years later. So I think it's time that we focusing on lifetime value. What is the value that we bring back to the customer today? The value that we bring back to them, like, years later. So when we kind of, think of that, like, these 3 things, I think, especially looking at, like, the Gen Zs, the millennials, and especially after pandemic, like, the customers have so much information on their fingertips, like, how much information they have. And that's why I'm like, always think of your customers as smarter than you. And, like, customers today are, like, and we are like, the ones who are catching up to them. So across the board. So I've worked for, like, some of the biggest brands. And I would say this, like, the successful brands are the ones who have, like, thought of their customers' evolution 10 years down the line. Yeah. So when I was working for Coca-Cola, for example, 2010, we were obsessing about 20. So like, what the customer in 2020 will want from us. So that is the kind of mindset that we need to have, that, like, predict as much as you can, like, what is it that you can do to address the need of what your customer will have in the future.
That makes sense. I like the concept that you raised around customer as, a shareholder or stakeholder, partner. And the thing that strikes me when you say that is, that requires a level of trust and personalization, right? In terms of how you're then going to communicate with those customers, if you think about them as shareholders. And so we kind of bring this back to the topic of, what happens after cookies. Again, I think a theme that we hear consistently is cookies going away is not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's in fact probably an outdated model if we're being, blunt about it. And because it doesn't really lend itself, right, to building trust and understanding, what's important to an individual consumer, one consumer at a time, so that you can build that bridge and communicate with them and meet them where they are. And so maybe, first of all, do you agree with that? And if so, how else do you go about, you got to combine, when we say build trust and speak to people, you have to do that in a way, obviously, that is compliant, that is what the consumer wants and expects from a digital experience, and from a customer experience. And so maybe talk a little bit more about, some of the strategies or the points of view that you have around collecting zero party and first party data, how you manage it, and all that goes into that.
Love that point, Mark, and I agree with it. Like, I think every time a change like this happens, it kind of us to think, which is think and innovate, and come up with something that might even be better than what it was the last time we had it. So definitely an opportunity for us to kind of explore and innovate. What I would say is the reason I think it's important for us to think of our customer extended team members is, to your point, we need to kind of provide to our customers what they need from us, right? So the foundation of that is the experience and the value that they get from us, right? So what I mean by that is, if you are a customer, and you'll notice this trend, like the previous question, Gen Zs and millennials, you'll notice how different segments have different expectations and different concerns. So somebody from one generation or segment might actually be too concerned about giving their credit card number. Like my mom, she won't really give it to she won't really give it to a vendor over the phone. I will have some inhibition, but I know my younger cousins, they don't care. They have stored in their Samsung Pay or Apple Pay, and they just go around and pay from their phone. So we need to understand what is it that the customer is expecting from us, and not all customers are going to kind of opt out of cookies and are going to opt out of tracking. Some actually will still stay in because at the end of the day, all companies are trying to make their experience better. Example is if I'm on Netflix, if I get those suggested movie titles or TV shows, I'm actually happy with it, right? I'm actually I'm actually happy that they are doing that customization for me. A lot of my friends and cousins have their Alexa or Siri or Google Voice on all the time, because they want them to hear them and respond to them whenever they have a question. So I think it's all about understanding what is it that our customers need, and what are they opting in for, and what they're opting in for. So, for example, I was on a website recently and that said, oh, by the way, better accept cookies. I'm like, okay, I accepted cookies. Next time I go onto the website, they forgot all about me. So I'm like, what is the point of accepting cookies or opting in if you're not really personalizing my experience? Right. So I think companies need to be very, very, very conscious of the promise that they're making to their customers. And when the customers are opting in and choosing to be tracked, give back to them what they are opting in for. So that's number one, understand what they want and then address their needs. Number two is first party data is becoming increasingly more and more relevant. And so is second party data sets. So meaning the partnerships that other brands, other organizations, it is important to kind of, find like, sharing approach or methodology where all of us benefit from like, our customers' information. But at the same time, number one priority is privacy. If the customers don't want the information to be shared with another organization, we have so we kind of stick our guns to it and like but there are customers who experience. There are customers who want for us to kind of go back to them and tell them, oh, by the way, like here's a deal you don't want to miss. So so like assuming like the customers are signing in and like they are customers and they don't really mind another partner or sister organization. That's when like the second party data set becomes super relevant. And number three is like with like customers opting out. It is not fair on the part of organizations to kind of not treat them the same way as you will to customers who are opting in for something. So I think we need to respect the fact that our customers have a choice. We need to respect the fact that customers today, like can experience has to be. At the same time, educate them, right? Like educate them like the benefits of like being tracked, and change the mindset, right? Like the mindset around ROAS or return on ad spend, I think has never been good. Like I've always been a champion of return on investment. Think long term, like if you're only like paying like a channel or a media or like looking at your marketing mix optimization, and you're saying that, oh, by the way, like the cheaper you like the cheaper your cost is to acquire a customer, that's the measure of your success based on the last touch. I think that mindset has to go away. The mindset, this is what I did, and this is the value that I created for the organization over the years, right? So I think that is the focus, like that I would say, like companies should have when it comes to performance-based attribution.
So that's really interesting. I mean, I think two things I heard there. One is the whole concept of trust that we've been talking about, and Sai mentioned it in his opening remarks as well. That trust has to be earned, right? So that's the difference, right? In the world that we're going to, it's no longer simply about buying data, right, or paying for access, but it's about also doing the necessary work up front to earn the trust of consumers. And then once you do, the payoff, right, is once you've got that trust, that in and of itself is extremely valuable, right? However, and this is the second part of what I think I heard you said, however, marketers and businesses need to maybe adjust the timelines that they typically apply to doing an ROI kind of analysis, right? It's more of a lifetime value, an evergreen kind of outlook versus a transactional one.
Yeah, 100%. And like one example is one of our prior companies. I won't name which one, but we were looking at like the channels that we put our money in, and like performance marketing, like being like of course forefront, trying to understand like this is what we've done, and like this is how much money we've spent. And then we went back and we were like, okay, so we might want to do something which is 2 times more, but the ROI is 4 times as much. So when we get too caught up like in like tracking cookies and like paying per like click, or like paying per like call to action, like we are like trying to kind of narrow down the entire value to like that one moment. But I think value for the stakeholders, for the organization, for our customers is created as a partnership over like several months, several years. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Like look at the long term.
And that's important, obviously, for Gannett, right? As you continue to evolve your business model, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Definitely. So as I'm sure like you guys have read and seen, like Gannett as an organization, like we are a subscription-led organization. So we are trying to make sure that we are out there providing content across digital, e-edition, and like print, and especially like on the digital side, we are trying to make sure that we are giving to our customers what they need from us. And like One example of that is like, right now, so again, like, personalization is the key. Right now, we allow for our users to follow topics, and like, then we kind of show them news relevant to that topic as they followed. However, like, as we evolve, as we kind of, personalize, we would want for our users to get exactly what they're looking for. So if you're a user who wants like, 5 minutes of quick updates and like, that's the only time you have to spare for news, we want to give you that. Or if you're a user who wants to read like, the opinions, detailed coverages, we want to give you that. So we want to kind of, ask our user what they, and also like, try like, learn continuously. So we all talk about machine learning, like, create an algorithm and like, it keeps on improvising. We want to kind of apply, we function as an organization, like, we want to learn at every opportunity that we have, every time we interact with a customer, and every time we kind of interact with a, make sure that we give back to them more than what we gave back to them yesterday. To kind of obsess about growing the customer value. So sorry, long-worded way of saying that we are transforming, and we are trying to make sure that we are not just relevant, but we are also like, a true partner in crime for our customers, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now you've got a couple of different customer cohorts. So the other being obviously advertisers. So how does all of this impact, you talk about partnerships, how does all of this change in our world kind of impact your relationship with your advertisers, your partners, and others kind of that make up your whole ecosystem?
Great question, Mark. So like one big caveat. So I've only been here for like just over a month. So still trying to kind of, learn a lot of like, the future impact. But what I would say is like, if you think of advertisers coming to us, or as a matter of fact, going to any channel, especially since I've been on the other side, like, with the CPG companies or with the healthcare systems. It is important for us to even think of our B2B customers as our partners and give back to them, like, I keep repeating this, but I think it's so important, like, give back to them more than like, what they've asked for or what we promised. So always over deliver. What I mean by that was to kind of, advertise. Don't just like, give them like, the last touch and last click and like, the impressions. Give them insights. Like, what is it that this customer is thinking? Especially like, one big advantage that we have is like a large readership, like, large number of like, unique visitors and like, readers. And I think us as like organization that's trifecta, digital, print, and e-edition, as well as like, having like this unique local coverage, as well as like, focused on building like, community-based like, information sources. I think we have that distinct advantage of going back to our advertisers and telling them like, what, this is what matters for this kind of customer in this kind of location. So I think like, to that point, again, as I said, like, we keep on learning, and as we learn, we keep on sharing. So that is how we create the value in the long term.
Great. Just a reminder again to folks who are watching and participating, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A thread, and we'll take those as they come. We hope you'll take a moment to drop a question in there. So Shiv, you talked a couple of times directly and indirectly about the whole customer journey, right? Giving more to the customer every day and giving more to them than they're giving to you. And we talked about that with Damon as well, right? Which is really this, the positive, I think, from a lot of the shifts that we're seeing is that there's a lot of focus being paid back again to what that end-to-end customer journey looks like, right? So even before someone signs up and becomes a customer, how are we as marketers targeting them? How are we speaking to them and targeting, that the definition of that has even changed, right? It's not about true targeting in a kind of surveillance sense like it has been in the past, but more about, how do we speak to people, whether it's through social or any type of digital content? How do we speak to people in a way that resonates with them at an individual level when we don't necessarily have all the information about them yet, right? They're not even a customer yet. And so maybe, talk a little bit about your experience, whether at Gannett or some of the prior companies you've been with, in terms of, taking that holistic approach, looking at customer acquisition through, making, delivering success and satisfaction for your customers, and turn them into repeat customers. Maybe talk a little about the customer journey and what you've done there in the past.
A fantastic question again, Mark. So I agree. I think it's important for us to kind of track our customers, or readers or users or members, whatever we call them, much before then they actually become our customers, and expectations. So track who they, more importantly, what do they expect. And when I say track, I don't really mean track exactly who this person is, where does he live or she live, and what do they do, but know, what are the broad segments that your customers come from? What are the channels that they come to you from? And also, what is the motivation that they have? So again, as any relationship, it's very important to understand what is it that takes a prospect or a target audience member to eventually consider your brand. So we had this concept back in the day at Coca-Cola, that if you think of this whole journey as a pyramid, we have broad awareness, and then we have consideration. You might be aware of a brand, but you might not want to consider it just yet, right? And then from there you look at what is it that makes them like you, and exclusively love you. Exclusively love meaning they only will shop your brand. And when you kind of have that mindset or that pyramid, then you try and look at drivers of conversion. So basically, what is it that motivates you as a user to basically prospect, to consider the brand, and to like it and love it, exclusively love it? And one thing that we did back in the day at Coca-Cola, for example, is we looked at functional as well as emotional. So a lot of times, people want to kind of come and buy your brand and be with you because they have that emotional connect. Or sometimes it's about functional. So in the media industry, for example, you might have a certain emotion attached to a certain local newspaper that you growing up, or your dad used to read, or your grandfather used to read, right? Or something that a show that your mother watched, right? That you have this emotions attached towards. So we need to understand how much of it matters for you to kind of a habit, based on your emotional connect, and of visiting our website, or from a brand perspective, buying and repurchasing the brand. And also what is it that matters for you from a functional perspective, which is most importantly, worth what it costs. So are we giving the value back to you? So when we do that, if that becomes the foundation of each journey checkpoint. So here, for example, at Gannett, what we are trying to do is we are trying to look at a customer journey when it starts as a prospect. When your journey starts, when you are a prospect, what is the promise that we make to you? And who are you? Where have you come from? Where do you live? What do you expect? And also, what is the voice of my customer? What is it that I know about, what you are saying on, on your feedbacks, on your, expectation setting. Then we look at onboarding, engagement, rewards and loyalty. And then, if at all for some reason we lose you, we want to win you back. And what is it that we can do about it? And then each of those journey touch points, we want to make sure, we are looking at each of those checkpoints with these three lenses: customer and voice of customer, feedback. So that's how we try to optimize it here. For me in the past, so
sounds good. So so next question, kind of get your crystal ball out. What do you see that the next year or two holds in terms of maybe trends that people aren't talking about yet, right? I think a lot of what we talked about will continue to come together over the coming months and quarters and years. But what are some of the things that you think might impact, whether it's your industry or kind of consumer marketing in general over the next couple of years?
Sure. So I think like maybe two or three trends that I can think of. Number one, I feel like the change is going to happen for better. So companies are going to adopt like a long-term outlook, and they are going to be more nimble than ever before. If anything, the pandemic has taught us we might not be as prepared as we think we are, right? So especially being hospitality during the pandemic has taught me so much, right? So and then radically different time to kind of be within health within a pandemic phase. So I think companies are going to adopt like a long-term outlook with a lot of agility built in, so that if at all there's something that kind of hampers their plan A, there's a plan B, plan C, which I think is adaptability, nimbleness, amazing. Number two is I think from an ad spend perspective, and especially when we talk about cookies and we talk about for better, meaning companies are going to look at the overall value that we have versus converting that one customer, or paying an organization for getting that one customer in. What is the overall mix? What is the overall value that we brought back to our stakeholders and also to our customers at the same time? Which I think is a beautiful thing. Moving from the return on ad spend to ROI, I think is a great strategic move that will take organizations much farther. And number three is I think personalization will still be the key. It is still extremely important for us to kind of optimize the time that our users have. So what I mean by that is all customers, especially from a digital subscriptions perspective, every customer of mine has 24 hours in their day. So that we can't change, right? They only have so much time. So we are all we are all in the same space competing for their mind share. And I want to make sure as an organization that is obsessed about the value that we give back to our customers, we know exactly what to deliver to them. If they have time and if they really love engaging with us over long-term articles, I want to kind of give back to them. Or if they only want the breaking news or the headlines, that's what I want to give back to them. But I think number three is leveraging the first party data set, leveraging the trust that customers have shown in us and built with us, and leveraging the whole concept around treating your customer as your extended team member, as your shareholder, leveraging that to basically design custom experiences for your customer. If they're opting in, reward them for opting in, give them that experience that they deserve because their cookie is being tracked, and continuously improve your product, because that's another thing that you promised to them. We're going to track your moves and we're going to give back to you something that you truly deserve. So I think make that promise, live up to that promise, but companies will start customizing and personalizing the experiences much more.
Yeah, so based on that, I mean, this really goes beyond just what the marketing strategies are, right? It's really the organization as a whole, what the outlook is on the customer journey, right? Because you talked about the product has to continually get better. Privacy, as we know, goes well beyond just the marketing organization's responsibility. So really, this part of the conversation started with me asking you about, what you see coming in the next year or two, and it really sounds like a lot of it is going back to, I shouldn't say going back to, maybe never left entirely, but certainly increasing again focus on long-term, sustainable, customer first, quality first kind of outlook, versus short-term only short-term transactional, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think And I think at times, like, we get too lost in terms of like, delivering those financial numbers and like, the gains. And the easy way out, like, I say that because I've been on both sides, is looking at what you see immediately. Like, what is it that you've seen last month, last 2 months back? The harder way out is to basically like, sit down and like, plan what is it that's going to come up next, and like, what is the long-term outlook. So I think that's the harder part, for not just like, the complexity of it, but also for the fact that, okay, do your like, stakeholders, investors trust in you enough to believe what you're saying in the long term is going to be true, right? Like, like for any other industry, for any other part of the business. And I think that is where like, we have to kind of, get the foundation right. So like, and like, show the value, not just like, short term or long term, but like, show that roadmap. Like, this is where you are, this is where we kind of, will be, and this is how we'll track to it, right? And if at all, like, in between of that roadmap, you kind of, find something that is not tracking, then you go back and like, course correct. But I think, like, at least like, in my past experience, that has worked well. Like, leaders, investors, stakeholders, customers trust you when the relationship is a continuum and not really like, in patches or like, binary.
Yeah, and it can't just be lip service, right? I mean, I think, another one of our participants here made a comment in the Q&A a little bit ago that, it's also beyond, when you look at particularly different demographic groups, right? Like you may have some who are very much more purpose driven, right? And they're looking and they're going to ask rightfully questions about, how your organization looks at things like, civil injustices or climate change or things like that, right? And so, it can't just be lip service, right? It has to be speaking to people, meeting them where they are, talking to them in their context, but also because it has to be based on trust, meaning it.
100%. 100%. Like, I cannot agree more with that. I think unless you show the value, like, nobody's going to trust you. Like, that's there's more that's coming, and that's why, like, from a user retention perspective in my world, it becomes so important to kind of, make sure our customers, one, see the value, second, they understand it, and third, you hear them out. So what we might think is amazing, they might not think it's amazing. So
Right.
so we'll have to challenge ourselves.
Okay, and then I know we only have a couple of minutes here before we go to Daniel. So time for one more question. I'll actually combine two questions. What innovations or technologies are you utilizing to execute your strategies? Has that changed since the pandemic began? And then also, have you shifted your data strategy in the past few months? So again, I assume that second one was also in relation to kind of coming out of the pandemic.
Great question. So I think so in terms of technologies, I think technologies kind of keep shifting and changing. But the mindset that has changed and the innovation that has changed is one, we are actually planning, like, as I said, like, in the beginning, we are not just planning for like 1 month, 2 months, 3 months out. We are planning a roadmap, like, 1 year, 2 years out. And we're also planning, like, not just in like, one fixed version. Like if you look at my roadmap, for example, I have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. So we need to kind of, be prepared of like, any shift that happens with the consumer trend, like, what is it that we can do to kind of, adapt towards that shift? And what is it that we need to plan as far as resourcing is concerned, as far as upskilling is concerned, as far as technology is concerned? Because my personal belief is like, you need to kind of, have that agility. You need to have that nimbleness, if there's a word like that, to basically like, keep shifting and changing based on the need of the hour. At the same time, like, you need to be very conscious and you need to kind of put in thought of what is it that will change, right? Like, pandemic might have not been something that we would have predicted, but digital acceleration for sure, like, that has been on the table for like so long. So if the companies were not really ready, they actually lost the battle, like, in the pandemic. Overall, in terms of data strategy, I think the core to that is transparency and harmonization. So